The charges have been dismissed. All of them. James Comey was in his kitchen when his lawyer called with the news, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago because he'd been too anxious to drink it. The charges lying to Congress, obstruction, crimes that could have sent the 70-year-old former FBI director to prison for years, had been dismissed. Not beaten at trial, not negotiated away in some plea bargain, but thrown out entirely because the prosecutor who'd brought them had no legal right to do so. His hand shook as he set down the phone. Not from relief, though that was there somewhere beneath the surface, but from the delayed reaction to 3 months of living under indictment. 3 months of waking up at 4 in the morning with his heart racing. 3 months of his grandchildren asking why Papa was on television again, why those people outside the courthouse were yelling. 3 months of wondering if the president would finally get what he'd wanted since that dinner back in 2017, the one where Trump had asked for loyalty and Comey had offered honesty instead. The stakes had been brutal and personal. Prison time, legal fees that were bankrupting him despite the defense fund, the destruction of a reputation he'd spent decades building, and beyond his own fate, there was the larger question hanging over everything. Could a president use the justice system to prosecute his enemies? Could retribution become official policy? But here's what nobody had prepared him for. The dismissal didn't feel like victory. It felt temporary. The judge's ruling said, without prejudice, which meant they could try again, they could find another prosecutor, refile the charges, drag him back into the nightmare. And what had caused the dismissal? Not the weakness of the evidence, not constitutional protections, but a technicality. The interim U.S. attorney who'd indicted him, a woman named Lindsay Halligan, had been unlawfully appointed. She'd never had the legal authority to prosecute anyone, which raised other questions, darker ones. Who had appointed her? Why had the previous U.S. attorney been forced out? And what happened next? The timeline had been building toward this moment for 8 years, ever since that January dinner in the White House when everything had started to fracture. Trump had been president for exactly 12 days. Comey had been FBI director for nearly 4 years. The dinner had been Trump's idea, a private meeting at the White House that Comey had found odd from the start because presidents typically didn't dine alone with FBI directors. There were protocols, boundaries meant to keep law enforcement independent from political pressure. Trump had asked him directly, I need loyalty, I expect loyalty, and Comey, sitting across the table in the green room, had felt the weight of what was being demanded. Not professional loyalty to the Constitution or to justice, but personal loyalty to Trump himself. You will always get honesty from me, Comey had replied. Trump had looked at him with an expression Comey would later describe to friends as calculating, trying to decide if honesty was an acceptable substitute. It wasn't. 3 months later, Trump fired him. The Russia investigation had been escalating, questions swirling about contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials, and Comey's FBI was in the middle of it. The official reason for the firing was Comey's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation, but Trump himself admitted on television that Russia was on his mind when he made the decision. I was going to fire Comey knowing there was no good time to do it, Trump told NBC's Lester Holt. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. The dismissal had triggered the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller, which had led to the investigation Trump called a witch hunt for 2 years, which had led to the Mueller report's careful documentation of contacts and obstruction, which had become a permanent scar on Trump's presidency, even though he'd been neither charged nor removed from office. Trump had never forgiven him. And when Trump won the 2024 election, returning to the White House after 4 years of Biden, everyone who'd been paying attention knew the retribution was coming. The first sign came in October 2025, 5 months into Trump's second term. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, a career prosecutor who had served under 3 administrations, was suddenly forced out. No explanation, no scandal, just a quiet push into resignation that the legal community understood immediately. He'd been asked to bring charges against Trump's enemies and had refused. The evidence wasn't there, he told the Attorney General's office. The cases were political, not prosecutorial, so they'd replaced him with Lindsay Halligan, an interim appointment who didn't require Senate confirmation, a loyalist who understood what was expected. She'd been 42 years old, ambitious, willing to do what the previous attorney had refused. Within weeks, she'd convened grand juries to investigate Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, the woman who successfully prosecuted the Trump Organization for financial fraud. The indictments had come down in mid-August, announced with theatrical timing during a slow news week when they dominate coverage. And Comey had been charged with lying to Congress about the Russia investigation and with obstruction for his handling of classified information. The charges were technical, built on interpretations of testimony he'd given years earlier, the kind of thing that normally wouldn't result in prosecution, but that looked sinister when packaged for cable news. He'd surrendered himself on a Tuesday morning, walking into the federal courthouse in Manhattan with his lawyers while protesters lined the street, some calling him a traitor, others calling him a hero. Nobody quite sure what the truth was anymore. His booking photo had been leaked within hours, showing a man who looked older than 70, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The media had gone insane. Every network covered it live. Legal analysts debated the charges. Trump had posted celebratory messages on social media. Lee and James Comey finally facing justice. The witch hunt is over, and now the real criminals are being held accountable. The MAGA base had treated it like a holiday, vindication for everything they'd believed about the deep state and political persecution. But here's what had been happening in the background, away from the cameras and the crowds. Comey's family had been living in a different kind of hell. His wife, Patrice, had stopped reading the news because the comment sections were too vicious. Their adult children had started getting threats. And worst of all, his grandchildren, the youngest just 5 years old, had started asking questions that no child should have to process. Why was Papa's picture on television? Why were people saying mean things about him? Was Papa going to jail? He tried to explain it in terms they could understand. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things, and sometimes those disagreements end up in court. Papa had done his job the way he thought was right, and some people were angry about that. The courts would figure it out. But even as he'd said the words, he'd wondered if they were true. Would the courts figure it out, or would political pressure and presidential rage overwhelm every institutional safeguard? The trial had been scheduled for January 2026. 3 months of preparation, of his legal team reviewing thousands of pages of testimony and documents, of witness lists being compiled and motions being filed. The prosecution had been aggressive, leaking details to friendly media outlets, portraying Comey as an arrogant bureaucrat who thought himself above the law. Halligan had given interviews calling the case straightforward and overwhelming. But there had been problems from the start, problems that legal experts had flagged immediately. The charges seemed strained, built on interpretations that stretched statutory language. More troubling, the entire prosecution felt tainted by political motivation. Trump had publicly demanded these charges for years. He'd made Comey's prosecution a campaign promise, and now, through an interim appointment that bypassed Senate oversight, that prosecution was happening. Constitutional scholars had started writing op-eds about the Appointments Clause, the constitutional provision that requires certain federal officers to be appointed properly and confirmed. An interim U.S. attorney could serve temporarily, but there were limits. Could someone serving in an interim capacity bring politically explosive indictments that the confirmed predecessor had refused to pursue? Several former attorneys general, Republicans and Democrats, had said no, had warned that this was a dangerous precedent. Then 3 weeks before trial, a motion had been filed by Comey's defense team challenging Halligan's appointment. The argument was technical but devastating. She'd been appointed under the wrong statutory authority. The law allowed interim appointments only under specific circumstances, and those circumstances hadn't existed when she was installed, which meant every action she'd taken, every subpoena issued, every indictment secured was legally void. The government had fought the motion hard, arguing that even if there'd been procedural irregularities, the charges themselves were valid and should proceed. But the judge, a Carter appointee who'd served on the bench for 40 years, had taken the challenge seriously. He'd ordered hearings, he'd reviewed the appointment documents, and yesterday he'd issued his ruling.
37 pages. Meticulous. Devastating. The appointment had been unlawful. Halligan had lacked authority. Everything she'd done was dismissed. The integrity of our prosecutorial system depends on proper appointment and oversight of those who wield its powers, the judge had written. When political expediency overrides constitutional requirements, the entire system loses legitimacy.
The ruling had been released at 9 a.m. Eastern. By 9:15, every major news organization had broken into regular programming. By 9:30, Comey's lawyer had called him with the news. By 10, Trump was posting in all caps about corrupt judges and rigged systems and the need to appeal immediately. But here's what Comey understood as he stood in his kitchen, reading the judge's decision on his phone. This wasn't over. The dismissal was without prejudice, meaning the charges could be refiled by a properly appointed prosecutor. The Attorney General had already announced plans to appeal the ruling and to seek a new indictment if the appeal failed. Trump wasn't going to let this go. The vendetta was permanent. His phone rang again. his oldest daughter calling to check on him. Dad, I saw the news. Are you okay? And he didn't quite know how to answer that. Was he okay? Legally, yes, for now. Emotionally, that was harder. He'd been vindicated on a technicality, but vindication on a technicality meant the substantive questions hadn't been answered. It meant the threat would continue. I'm okay, he told her, trying to make his voice steady. It's good news. We'll see what happens next. But they both knew what happened next. Trump would find another prosecutor, someone with proper credentials and Senate confirmation, someone who'd bring the charges again. The nightmare would restart. The grandchildren would ask more questions. The media circus would return. And somewhere in the broader landscape, other people were having their own reactions to the ruling, processing what it meant for them personally and for the country. Letitia James, whose charges had also been dismissed, was holding a press conference calling it a victory for the rule of law while knowing that Trump's rage would only intensify. Lindsay Halligan was cleaning out her office, her career probably over, sacrificed for a prosecution that had collapsed. And Trump himself was in the Oval Office, reportedly furious, demanding that someone explain how a low-level judge could overturn presidential priorities. Because that was the real question beneath everything. Who had the power? Could a president direct prosecutions of his enemies? Could he replace prosecutors who refused and install ones who'd comply? And when that compliance led to procedural violations, what happened? Did the rule of law prevail, or was it just a speed bump on the road to retribution? Comey had spent his entire career believing in institutions, in the idea that systems and procedures could constrain individual power. He believed that even presidents had limits, that the law applied equally, that justice was more than just politics in robes. The Russia investigation had tested that belief. The firing had strained it. The indictment had nearly broken it. And now this dismissal, technical, procedural, temporary, was forcing him to ask whether he'd been naive all along. He thought about the dinner again, that moment when Trump had asked for loyalty. What if he'd said yes? What if he'd understood that in Trump's world, institutions only mattered when they served presidential interests, that independence was just weakness wearing a respectable mask? Would his life have been easier? Would he have avoided the firing, the investigation, the indictment, the 3 months of his grandchildren seeing his booking photo? Probably. But he also would have become something he didn't recognize, someone who had traded integrity for survival. And if enough people made that trade, if enough prosecutors and judges and officials chose loyalty over law, then the institutions themselves would become meaningless. They'd be props, decorations that gave the appearance of justice while serving the interests of power. That's what this dismissal really represented. Not victory, but a test. One judge had said no, had insisted on following procedures even when it meant derailing a president's vendetta. But would the next judge do the same? Would the next prosecutor resist? Or would they learn from Halligan's failure and find better legal footing for the same political prosecution? And would the public care, or had everyone become so tribal that justice was just another partisan battlefield? The Attorney General appeared on television that afternoon, her face composed, her language careful. We respect the court's decision while believing it was wrongly decided. We will appeal, and we will work with Congress to ensure that interim appointments are properly authorized going forward. The charges against Mr. Comey remain serious, and justice will be served. Translation: we're coming back, better prepared, with proper paperwork next time. Comey watched the statement with his wife beside him on the couch, both of them processing what it meant. Relief, yes, but also exhaustion. How many more rounds of this could they endure? How many more grand juries and indictments and trials? He was 70 years old. His savings were depleted from legal fees. His grandchildren were asking questions no children should have to ask. And the President of the United States had made destroying him a personal mission. Maybe we should leave, Patrice said quietly. Not leave the room. Leave the country. Move somewhere Trump's reach didn't extend. Somewhere they could have peace. It wasn't the first time she'd suggested it, but Comey knew he wouldn't go. Running would feel like admission, like Trump had won after all. And maybe that was pride, or maybe it was principle, but he needed to see this through. That evening, his legal team held a conference call to discuss next steps. The dismissal would be appealed, probably reaching the Supreme Court given the stakes involved. If they lost on appeal, the charges would be reinstated and they'd go to trial. If they won on appeal, the government could refile with a properly appointed prosecutor and they'd be back at square one. Either way, the legal battle was nowhere near finished. One of his lawyers asked the question they'd all been avoiding: do you want to try negotiating? Maybe there's a deal where this goes away quietly? And Comey felt anger rise in his chest, the first clean emotion he'd experienced all day. A deal would mean admitting guilt, even implicitly. It would mean giving Trump the satisfaction of a concession. and it would mean abandoning the principle that had gotten him into this mess in the first place, that honesty mattered more than loyalty. No deals, he said. If they want to prosecute me, they can try. But I'm not pleading to something I didn't do just to make Trump happy. His lawyers had expected that answer, but hearing it said aloud changed something. It meant they were committed to fighting however long it took, whatever it cost. Over the next few days, the legal and political communities processed the ruling, everyone trying to figure out what it meant for the balance of power. Some saw it as proof that the system worked, that procedural safeguards could still constrain presidential overreach. Others saw it as a temporary obstacle that would be overcome once the administration learned to do its I's and cross its T's. The truth was probably somewhere in between. The system was working, but barely, under enormous strain, with no guarantee it would survive the next test. Comey gave his first interview since the dismissal to a network news anchor, sitting in his living room for the cameras, trying to explain what the experience had been like. The hardest part wasn't the legal jeopardy, he said. It was explaining to my 5-year-old granddaughter why people she'd never met were saying terrible things about her papa. That's what this kind of prosecution does. It doesn't just threaten the defendant, it tries to break their spirit by attacking everything they love. The anchor asked if he regretted refusing Trump's request for loyalty back in 2017. Comey paused, thinking about the question carefully. No, he finally said, because if I'd said yes, I wouldn't recognize the person looking back at me in the mirror. The cost has been high, but the alternative would have been worse. You can't serve justice and serve a person at the same time. Eventually, you have to choose. That clip went viral, shared millions of times across social media, dissected and debated and turned into partisan ammunition. Trump's supporters called it arrogant, proof that Comey thought himself above the president. Trump's critics called it heroic, a defense of institutional independence. And Comey himself just felt tired, wishing people could hear what he'd actually said, instead of the version that fit their pre-existing narratives. Meanwhile, in Washington, the legal machinery was already turning toward the next attempt. The Attorney General was consulting with the White House counsel's office about proper appointment procedures. Lists of potential prosecutors were being compiled, career attorneys who could withstand confirmation hearings, whose credentials were impeccable, who could bring the same charges without the procedural flaws that had doomed Halligan. They were learning from the failure, adapting their strategy, preparing to try again. And in the background, other targets were watching and waiting. Letitia James, whose charges had also been dismissed, was preparing for the next round. Other prosecutors who investigated Trump were getting their affairs in order, knowing they might be next. Former officials who testified against him during impeachment proceedings were consulting lawyers. The enemies list was long, and the dismissal hadn't shortened it. If anything, it had intensified Trump's determination to make everyone pay. Comey thought about history, about other moments when institutions had faced similar tests. Watergate, when courts had forced the president to surrender tapes, and a Saturday Night Massacre had failed to stop the investigation. Iran-Contra, when prosecutions had moved forward despite presidential pardons. The travel ban cases, when judges had pushed back against executive overreach. The system had survived those challenges, but survival wasn't the same as health. Each confrontation left scars, weakened norms, established precedents that future presidents could exploit. What would the precedent be here? That presidential vendettas could be pursued as long as the paperwork was in order. That political prosecutions were acceptable if the prosecutor was properly appointed, or that courts would scrutinize these cases carefully, that procedural requirements actually mattered, that judges would serve as a check on executive revenge. He didn't know the answer yet. Nobody did. This was still unfolding, still testing limits that previous generations had thought secure, and the outcome would depend on decisions that hundreds of people would make in the coming months. Prosecutors choosing whether to bring charges, judges deciding whether to allow them, officials deciding whether to comply or resist. That night, after the interviews and the conference calls and the endless news coverage, Comey sat with his youngest granddaughter reading her a bedtime story about a knight who protected the kingdom by following rules even when the king wanted him to break them. She asked if the story was real, and he told her it was make-believe, but that the idea behind it was true, that rules protected everyone, even kings, especially kings. "Is that why people are mad at you, Papa?" she asked. "Because you followed rules?" And he felt his throat tighten, because she'd understood something that half the country seemed to have forgotten. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. That's why she hugged him then, with the uncomplicated affection that only small children can manage, and for a moment the indictment and the dismissal and the uncertain future didn't matter as much as the weight of her small arms around his neck. The next morning he woke up to news that Trump had filed paperwork formally appealing the dismissal, accompanied by a post calling the judge a radical leftist activist who should be impeached. The legal battle was resuming exactly as everyone had predicted, and Comey, standing in his kitchen with another mug of coffee that would probably go cold, realized he'd reached a strange kind of peace with the situation. He couldn't control Trump's vendettas or the Attorney General's decisions or how the appeals court would rule. He couldn't make the charges disappear or restore restrained savings or erase his granddaughter's questions. What he could control was his response, whether he'd let the fear break him, whether he'd compromise to make it stop, whether he'd maintain the standards he'd insisted mattered even when they cost him everything. The dismissal had bought him time but not freedom. The fight would continue probably for years, maybe for the rest of his life. Trump didn't forgive, didn't forget, didn't give up, which meant Comey's choice, made 8 years ago across a dinner table in the White House, was still defining his life. He'd chosen honesty over loyalty, institutions over individuals, principle over survival. And standing there in the morning light, exhausted and vindicated and terrified all at once, he made the choice again. Whatever came next, appeals, refiled charges, more trials, more media circuses, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything since 2017. Not because he was brave, though maybe he was. Not because he was confident in the outcome, because he wasn't. But because the alternative, giving Trump what he wanted, admitting that loyalty mattered more than truth, would mean the real James Comey had already been destroyed, and only a hollow shell remained. The phone rang again. Another interview request, another legal consultation, another chapter in a story that wouldn't end cleanly or quickly, or probably at all. He answered it, his voice steady, ready to explain once more why some things were worth defending even when the defense seemed futile. Because if people like him stopped defending them, who would? And if nobody defended them, what would be left? That was the real question hanging over everything, not whether Comey would be convicted or exonerated, but whether the institutions he tried to protect would survive the attempt to weaponize them. The dismissal suggested they might, but it also showed how fragile they were, how dependent on individual judges making individual decisions, how vulnerable to determined assault by someone willing to keep trying until the defenses finally cracked. In the end, that's what made the dismissal feel less like victory and more like postponement. The threat hadn't ended, it had just changed form. And everyone involved, Comey, Trump, the prosecutors, the judges, knew they were engaged in a longer struggle about the nature of American justice itself. Could it remain independent? Could it resist political pressure? Or would it become just another tool of presidential power deployed against enemies and withdrawn from friends? The answer would emerge case by case, ruling by ruling, decision by decision, and James Comey standing in his kitchen with cold coffee and a ringing phone and grandchildren who deserved better than this would be there to see it. Not because he wanted to be, but because running would mean conceding that loyalty had always mattered more than law, and he'd spent too much refusing that concession to start accepting it now.